This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Valerie Sanderson, and in the early hours of Saturday the 27th of March, these are our main stories. A major report into the role France played in the Rwandan genocide has criticised French failures, saying the country was blind to the preparation of the massacre of 800,000 people. A search and rescue operation has been taking place in southern Egypt, where more than 30 people were killed when two trains collided.
They can't remove the people from underneath the trains. It's a shame. Look at the children. We need a crane. People are dead. We can't even save the ones who are alive.
A $1.6 billion lawsuit has been brought against Fox News by the company it accused on air of interfering with votes cast in last year's US presidential election. Also in this podcast, we're in Tanzania, where the former president, John Magufuli, has been laid to rest in his hometown of Chato, 9 days after the government said he died from heart disease. And later,
you queue first, you smell it when you walk in a bakery, and then you ask the madame behind the counter, I'll have a baguette, s'il vous plaît, and then she gives you a baguette, and what's the first thing you do with it? You get it in your finger, and the first thing you do, you don't even know you're doing it, you give it a squeeze, don't you?
France nominates its beloved baguette for inclusion on UNESCO's Cultural Heritage Register. We begin this podcast in France, where a major report on the country's role at the time of the genocide in Rwanda in 1994 has strongly criticised the failures of the country's establishment. The commission of experts put in place on the orders of President Emmanuel Macron said France bore overwhelming responsibilities in relation to the killing of members of Rwanda's minority Tutsis and moderate Hutus in a frenzy of violence over 100 days. More than 800,000 people were massacred. Lindsay Hilsum was in Kigali for the BBC at the time.
I've seen some of the most terrible things today that I've ever seen. It's been absolutely horrific. The killings, the random killings, the soldiers going around and groups of youths armed with knives. I'm afraid I think that's still going on. So even though it may sound quieter, I have a horrible feeling that in the suburbs of Kigali, that doesn't mean that things are better at all. In fact, it may mean that things are even worse.
That was Rwanda 27 years ago. Our Paris correspondent Hugh Schofield told me more about the report.
It's particularly damning in its criticism of President Mitterrand, who was president at the time. Not only does it criticise his assessment of Rwandan politics, which it said was heavily influenced by a kind of blinkered francophone view of the world, where he saw that the Hutus under President Habyarimana were good because supporting French, and the Tutsi rebels were bad because English-speaking, coming from Uganda and representing a kind of Anglo-British interest in the continent. And this sort of vision, this interpretation of events became obsessive, and that the other failing was that he then took over policy. Mitterrand ran policy from the Elysée. It became a really big deal for him, and so all the conventional and regular channels of power and communication, diplomatic, military, intelligence, were taken over by the president, and anyone who suggested other interpretations was simply ignored, and all that created the ground for the genocide. The historians certainly do not accuse the French of genocide or even complicity in genocide, but they do accuse them of a responsibility in ignoring signs which were clearly there about the radical nature of some in that regime.
I mean, President Mitterrand is dead, of course, now, isn't he? I mean, how will this report be viewed by the French authorities in the present, do you think?
Well, I mean, look, it's not a huge surprise. I mean, the French were there. There's been plenty of criticism of the French over the years, and this interpretation that it was Mitterrand dovetailing a personal contact with Habyarimana, a friendship with him, with classic preserving French interests in Africa, and that blinkering him to the reality of what was going on. That's not new. What's new is that it's from historians who are respected, who've consulted acres of documents and archives and so on. This is very, very authoritative and will undoubtedly go down as a sort of definitive text on France's role.
I suppose the question now is, will it heal any historic wounds? Because Rwanda has long accused France of being complicit, isn't it, in what happened back in the 1990s?
Well, indeed, and the relations with Kigali now have not great. They've been certainly up and down. As time goes by and as more sort of self-exploratory analyses like this come out, clearly that will help to build bridges of understanding. And certainly Macron's desire, as with the Algerian war, is to take a hard, dispassionate look at the evidence and to come to conclusions, not to point fingers, not to blame anyone. As you say, Mitterrand's long dead, it really doesn't matter anymore. There are some players still around, but simply to kind of get that kind of appeased, peaceful, shared interpretation of what happened, so that people can start building bridges again.
Hugh Schofield. In Egypt, an operation has been underway to try and free people trapped by a collision between two trains in the southern province of Sohag. More than 30 people are known to have died and scores more were injured when several carriages derailed and overturned. Dozens of ambulances were sent to the scene. This man arrived there shortly after the crash.
We need an official to come and see what has happened. They can't remove the people from underneath the trains. It's a shame. Look at the children. We need a crane, but they said it's an I-40. People are dead. We can't even save the ones who are alive.
From Cairo, our correspondent Sally Nabil told us more.
Apparently, the two trains were on one track, and what official statements say is that a group of unidentified men pulled the emergency brakes on one of the two trains, causing both trains to collide. So the initial assessment is that it is a deliberate act, but the statement didn't elaborate, and we are expecting more details later. But the accident by all means is horrific, and pictures and videos we are getting from the scene are absolutely heartbreaking, and they are very chaotic. People are so angry, they are screaming. We understand there are people still trapped under the wreckage. Medical teams have been flown from Cairo to Sohag, and it is one of Egypt's poorest provinces. It lacks the very basic services. The Prime Minister has already visited the scene, and he visited the wounded in hospitals, so it is a very tragic day for Egyptians.
And these were two passenger trains. Were they packed?
Yes, apparently they were packed, and usually trains heading to the south are used by lower middle class and poor class people, and that collision caused an uproar on social media. Users are saying it is usually the poor who pay the price for chronic problems that never get fixed by the government. And it's worth mentioning that train crashes happen quite often in Egypt. They happen frequently over the past 2 or 3 decades. And ministers and officials keep promising reforms, keep promising directing funds into the transportation system, but none of these promises materialize. Accidents keep happening and many lives are lost.
Sally Nabil. 6 months after the war in the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh broke out, the reverberations are still being felt. Armenia, which lost, has been gripped by political instability and demonstrations, and the country's Prime Minister has announced that fresh elections will be held in June. With the Armenian army forced to pull out of the region, Russia now has some 2,000 peacekeepers on the ground. As our correspondent Jonah Fisher reports, the Kremlin has significantly increased its influence in the region.
We drive towards Armenia's border with Nagorno-Karabakh. With the Armenian army pulling out, it's now 2,000 Russian peacekeepers who act as the guarantor of the enclave's security.
I'm now at what's known as the Lachin corridor. It is perhaps the most crucial point in this new peace agreement. This road, and it's a fabulously winding road that leads down a valley and up the other side. This road is the only link between Armenia, the outside world, and this ethnic Armenian enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, since the war, the Armenians no longer control who and what uses this road. There's a Russian military checkpoint. It's about 500 meters from where I am now. It's up to the Russian military who comes in and out of the enclave. And that basically means that the Russians call the shots round here.
We're denied permission to enter and are told privately that the Russians are now blocking almost all foreigners.
It's a real pain that we have to talk like this rather than in person, Mr. Baglarian.
That evening, we speak to a Nagorno-Karabakh official, Artak Baglarian, on a WhatsApp call.
Has Nagorno-Karabakh become another one of these little states that we see in this part of the world which are occupied by Russia?
No, actually there is no occupation by Russia. There is Russian peacekeeping forces here in Artsakh in order to protect our life and our security.
So you're happy to have Russia there? It's better than having Azerbaijan occupy you?
We are happy to live in our own land and to continue our struggle for our independence.
The war and the deployment of peacekeepers has returned Russia to a pivotal role in the southern Caucasus. And that's not all. Russia analyst Sergei Markov says Armenia's painful experience has delivered a powerful message to other leaders in the post-Soviet space.
Russian influence have been increased after this peace deal, not only inside Azerbaijan and Armenia, but also in other countries as well, because of other countries now has the lesson. If you have American puppet as your leader of your country, you will lose your territory.
The so-called American puppet is Nikol Pashinyan, Armenia's prime minister. He came to power in a popular uprising 3 years ago and has shouldered much of the blame for the loss of Karabakh. There have been several months of demonstrations in Yerevan against Mr. Pashinyan. Critics, such as opposition politician Levon Zurabian, say he should have maintained better relations with Moscow and, given Azerbaijan's alliance with Turkey, made concessions to try to avoid war.
Despite all of these facts, Nikol Pashinyan chose to reject the peace proposals that were negotiated. So that was a huge diplomatic failure that actually brought a catastrophe to Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh.
Russia, not Armenia, is now Nagorno-Karabakh's key relationship. Moscow will ultimately have to decide if it wants a long-term military presence protecting the Armenian enclave. If not, Azerbaijan will surely get its way and take control of all of Nagorno-Karabakh.
Jonah Fisher. While the world's coronavirus vaccine drive continues, the political and commercial arguments are also ongoing. France's foreign minister has warned that countries should not use blackmail in order to get their populations vaccinated. Jean-Yves Le Drian also suggested to a radio interviewer that Britain had a problem with delivering second doses of vaccine. From Paris, here's Lucy Williamson.
Jean-Yves Le Drian was quizzed by the presenter as to whether Europe had been scammed by sending vaccines to the UK and not receiving any in return. He said that while the UK took pride in having vaccinated a lot of people with their first jabs, they had a problem delivering the second. We need to build a cooperative relationship with the UK, Mr Le Drian said, so that AstraZeneca fulfills its commitment to the EU, but one can't play with blackmail, having given a lot of first jabs and then run into problems with the second. The EU shouldn't be paying the price for that policy. He said he hoped to come to an agreement, saying it would be staggering to have a vaccine war between the UK and the EU.
Lucy Williamson. Well, let's stay in France, where the baguette has been chosen as the country's candidate for UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage status. It'll join a list including the sauna culture in Finland, a lantern festival in South Korea, and a grass mowing competition in Bosnia-Herzegovina. The baguette, a long loaf of bread, is synonymous with French culture. According to one estimate, some 10 billion baguettes are consumed every year in France. That's around 320 every single second. Julian Marshall has been speaking to the French baker and author Richard Bertinet, who explained that buying a baguette is a cherished ritual.
You go to the bakery in the morning, and what's the first thing you do when you buy your baguette? You queue first, you smell it when you walk in the bakery, and then you point at your baguette, you look at it, and then you ask the madame behind the counter, I'll have a baguette, s'il vous plaît, and then she gives you a baguette. And what's the first thing you do with it when you buy your baguette?
Well, you take it home.
No, before that. You get it in your finger, and the first thing you do, you don't even know you're doing it, you give it a squeeze, don't you?
Uh-huh.
You give it a squeeze.
Yeah.
And then imagine that baguette in your finger, give it a squeeze, and imagine that crack. What's happening in your stomach now? Just above your stomach, you can feel something switched on now. Yeah. And that's switched on there. Now your mouth salivating. I can hear it. And then your brain now is switched on. So now you start to digest already. So that baguette already is doing its work because the crunch is everything. That's what helps you to digest better. Now, if you buy a baguette which is all soft and disgusting from which is not a proper boulangerie, you will never get that. And that's the thing. And then you come out of the bakery, you crack the baguette, the top, the crouton, we call it, and then you start chewing on it. And before you arrive home, half of the baguette is gone already.
Well, I certainly know that experience. But you seem to be suggesting that buying a baguette is as important a part of the ritual as making it or eating it.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. In France, when you grow up, every village we have 2 or 3 bakeries, and you might buy your baguette from one bakery and your croissant from another one, because everyone is specialized on different things. It's a very part of your life every day. When you leave the house in the morning, you ask the other person, or your wife or your husband or your kids, who's going to buy the bread for lunch. You cannot come back home without bread. It's impossible. You can't sit for lunch or dinner without bread. So it's a very big part of our tradition.
So French people themselves know how central the baguette is to their heritage. Does it really need, therefore, to be included on UNESCO's Intangible Cultural Heritage Register?
Yes, it does, because you need to know that local baker made the baguette the traditional way, with proper flour and respecting the tradition of making baguette. So he's got the right to call it a baguette. It's same as the pizza, Napolitan pizza. They've been protected. There's some bread in Kazakhstan who's been protected. We lose them otherwise.
Oh, my mouth is watering over the thought of that baguette. French baker and author Richard Bertinet. And from bread to wine, later in the podcast, we'll hear about the French Bordeaux that has just spent a year in outer space. This is the Global News Podcast. Still to come.
Wind in the hair, leg in the pencil.
Terms of Endearment author Larry McMurtry has died at the age of 84. Our arts correspondent looks back at the career of the American novelist and screenwriter. The US presidential election in 2020 will be remembered for the claims by the incumbent in the White House, Donald Trump, that he'd been cheated out of a second term. He alleged that the voting machines were defective, accusations that were broadcast by the US TV network Fox News. Well, now Dominion, the company that produced the election voting machines, has launched a lawsuit against Fox News for $1.6 billion, accusing Fox of spreading lies about the election being fraudulent. Dominion said it had tried repeatedly to set the record straight, but was ignored by Fox News. I heard more from our Washington correspondent, Gary O'Donoghue.
That's what they're alleging, that effectively Fox continued to what it calls spread the lies about these voting machines. And of course there were lots of stories around at the time about people claiming that the machines were sort of manufactured to count Donald Trump's votes as worth less than Joe Biden's and things like that, and made in Venezuela and all that kind of thing. And so they have already filed various other lawsuits against some individual presenters on the Fox News network, but now they're obviously slapping them with this sort of $1.6 billion suit. So this legal action is going to continue, and they're not the only company that are taking actions, but other voting machine companies have also taken action.
And what is Fox News' response to this lawsuit?
Well, it's predictable. I mean, it's saying it stands by its election coverage. It's saying that it was completely balanced and reporting legitimate news stories, and that it will defend what it says as unfair accusations. Having said all that, of course, they did take one of their presenters off air who had been accused of doing this when the first cases were filed, so that I think they're feeling some of the pressure here. But it's interesting that these companies really do seem to be going after the network, and we'll see if they go any wider and any broader in their accusations in the coming weeks, because of course the former president himself was involved in spreading some of these rumours.
Well, they've already filed lawsuits against Donald Trump's lawyers, haven't they?
Yeah, they've filed a lawsuit against his campaign lawyer, Sidney Powell, and also against his personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, of course, both of whom were involved in talking about the Dominion machines in particular and their role in places like Georgia.
Gary O'Donoghue. And next we go to Tanzania. And to the burial service for the country's late president, John Pombe Magufuli, who was laid to rest today in his hometown of Chato along the shores of Lake Victoria. Thousands of mourners had the chance to pay their respects in the past week as his funeral cortege was taken to various points across the country. 61-year-old John Magufuli, who'd led Tanzania since late 2015, is the first head of state of the country to die while in office. Abubakar Famau is in Chato for the BBC.
It has been a sorrowful occasion as Tanzanians have been keenly following the event, but also it was well attended, I can say, by senior government officials, including the President of Tanzania, Samia Suluhu Hassan, and also former heads of states were around. But also there were other, guests from other organizations, other parastatals and all that, and also the general public that turned up in their hundreds at Magufuli Stadium here in Chato. Basically, as early as dawn, the gates were open at the stadium, and people started pouring at the event, at the venue, I will say. But by around 8 o'clock in the morning, the body of the late President Magufuli was taken from his compound to the church, where there were special prayers that were held at the church. He's a Catholic, so he was taken to a Catholic church. Then later, the body was taken back to Magufuli Stadium. That's where, there were other, prayers that were held by religious leaders, and also some speeches that were given at the occasion. At that particular time, also the President of Tanzania addressed the mourners, and also she recounted some of the beautiful memories that she had with the President, especially when she last time came here in Chato. And this is what she said.
Today I am in Chato for the third time. The first time I came during the 2015 campaigns, the second time I came to pay my tribute to our brother who had lost his sister. And we were with him together with other leaders the whole day. And I thought maybe when I come to Chato again, I would meet my host to receive me. But in contrary to that, we have come to Chato to bury our father, brother, leader and teacher.
The words of Samia Suluhu Hassan, ending that report from Abubakar Famau. Senegal has been convulsed by some of the worst unrest in more than a decade. According to Amnesty International, 12 people have died in anti-government protests, which saw thousands of young people take to the streets earlier this month. The West African nation is usually seen as a model of democracy, but the country's economy has suffered during the pandemic. Our correspondent Ben Hunt has sent this report from Dakar on why young people have had enough.
On the back streets of a coastal area of Dakar is the home of Cher, a young tailor who was recently shot dead in the protests. His twin sister, Goni, is crying in the corner, too upset to talk to us. But his older brother, Abdoulaye Wade, wants to speak out.
My brother went to the protest to fight for the youth of our country. Young people here can't find work. This is the lack of jobs. They have lost hope. It's these people he was fighting for, and that's why he was there, holding the Senegalese flag.
The protests kicked off after the arrest of opposition leader Ousmane Sonko. He was accused of rape. But some people are worried that the case is an attempt by President Macky Sall to silence the opposition. University students were among the protesters. Master's student Fatimata Top didn't join them, but she shares their concerns. She lost her job as a receptionist in the pandemic and thinks she'll have to move abroad to find work.
Once you get your degree, you are toiling to have a job. When it comes to find a job, if they do not know you, you are not going to have that job.
Well, that's corruption.
Senegalese people are so corrupt from the head to the bar, really. That's the reality.
We're here in a suburb of Dakar and we're at a hip-hop centre. So I'm seeing young people, I'm hearing beats in the background, and I'm here with rapper Fou Malade. Tell me a bit about where we are.
We are in Gejawai, one of the biggest suburbs of Dakar, where we have poverty, where we have prostitution. That's why we think about a project called Natal Alak. Natal Alak means growing the future with young people by the usage of hip-hop.
And what are you doing?
We give them tools of their own emancipation, graffiti, rhymes and poetry. We just try to connect music and social problems to bring change.
Fou Malade was a founding member of the decade-old activist group Yon Amar, meaning we've had enough. 9 years ago, they were key to the then opposition leader Macky Sall's victory. But now they say his presidency is part of the problem. And Fou Malade is worried about the country's future.
I'm very scared for young people because when political leaders lying to the people, most of them, young people, will get radicalized. They will take rifles to make change.
22-year-old musician Fatou, better known as Kikis, is a community organizer at the centre.
Here, young, they don't feel part of the system and they don't have anything to do, so they turn to crime.
This song, which she wrote herself in the Wolof language, is about the loss of hope and being undervalued. It sums up the feelings of a generation.
Ben Hunt in Dakar. Now earlier, after the baguette, we promised you some news on French wine. Well, a group of French connoisseurs have detected a sprinkle of stardust at their latest testing, where they were the first people in the world to sample and review wine that spent a year in space as part of an experiment on the effect of lack of gravity. It wasn't any old plonk either, but a 21-year-old prize Bordeaux Petrus worth around $5,500 a bottle. Jane Anson, contributing editor of Decanter magazine, was one of the enophiles who took part in the taste test.
There were 12 of us in the room who were tasting. I was the only journalist, very lucky to be there. And we were given 3 glasses in front of us. We didn't know what they were, but we were told that half of us in the room had 2 glasses that had been to space and 1 that had been on Earth. And the other 6 had the other way around. So 2 Earth and 1 space, but we didn't know who had what. And we had to look at them and identify through aromas and through taste and then through smell. Petrus is a wine which has the 100% Merlot grape. So you're looking at something which is one single grape to see how that has survived. But also it's a wine which has got a lot of structure to it. It's really a good quality wine which should do well over 21 years. So from my experience of tasting it, what I could see was the one that had remained on Earth was exactly like you would expect, which means that lovely, deep, rich colour, beautiful aromatics, but still quite young. And then the other glass, for me, was just slightly more pink around the edges, a little bit more evolved. And what happens with this kind of wine when they get older is you get lovely floral aromatics, truffle aromatics, so like, violet, peony, all that kind of stuff. And that was more obvious to me in the wine that had been in space. But I mean, it really is part of a big ongoing experiment. And what's interesting is they sent not just wine, but they sent little vine plants up, so budwood from a vine plant up into space. And this, again, is why NASA were really very happy to allow this to happen. It's part of future of agriculture. What does this mean for climate change on Earth? And can we equip plants basically with a better way to react to climate change? Then they hope within 2 years to be doing a fermentation up on the International Space Station as well.
Thank you to that. Jane Anson. The American novelist and screenwriter Larry McMurtry, who won a Pulitzer Prize and an Oscar, has died at the age of 84. Over more than 5 decades, he wrote more than 30 books and more than 30 screenplays, including Brokeback Mountain, for which he won an Academy Award in 2006.
The nominees for Best Screenplay based on material previously produced or published are Larry McMurtry and Diana Osana for Brokeback Mountain, based on the short story by Annie Crew.
Our arts correspondent Vincent Dowd told me more about his life and work.
He was a writer of human character and human weakness especially, always in very well-drawn places. That was often Texas, where he was from. He was actually born in Archer City, population well under 2,000. And in many novels, that hometown is there, often renamed Talia. In some cases, he did write historically, for instance, Lonesome Dove, for which, as you say, he won the Pulitzer Prize. That was a Western made into a hit TV series. Terms of Endearment was actually set in big city Houston. So he did have a range. He didn't actually write the screenplay for that hit film, but in 1971, he co-wrote with Peter Bogdanovich the script from his own novel of, I think, a superb film starring Jeff Bridges, Cloris Leachman and Sybil Shepherd, The Last Picture Show.
You wouldn't believe how this country's changed. I reckon the reason why I always drag you out here is probably I'm just as sentimental as the next fella when it comes to old times.
But, Mama, it's a sin, isn't it? Unless you're married, you know I wouldn't do that.
Tough it out! Tough it out! You gotta be men like the rest of them.
I'll see you in a year or two if I don't get shot.
Oh, cold heart.
As it happens, Val, I just happened to watch that film again about 3 weeks ago, only on DVD, as one does at the moment. I was in tears at the end. It's still a fantastically evocative film.
And he won the Oscar, didn't he, for Brokeback Mountain?
Yes, he did. So he had that separate career as a screenwriter. He was a professional writer. He never really had another job. He described himself as a minor regional writer. I never was sure whether that was a joke or not. He wasn't a very effusive man, if you look at interviews with him. He occupied a sort of middle territory between genre fiction and literary fiction. He wrote very simply and very directly. I suppose that may have been what endeared him to Hollywood. The stories were always there. In McMurtry books, you'll find comedy, and you will always find profound sadness, and you will find a lot of love gone wrong. I think that's why in those movies they used Hank Williams songs, because that was kind of in the same world of regret. I know this may sound terribly banal to say as an arts correspondent, but he wrote about people with all our flaws. He also had, slightly strangely, a second career for the last half of his life. He loved being a bookseller. Some people who write books don't physically like books, but he loved it. It all started in Washington, D.C. 50 years ago, but it's now still based in Archer City, where he came from. A very big, very obviously well-run bookstore called Booked Up, where, of course, they will be in deep mourning today. I have to say it looks like very attractive stock online. And one day...
You're going to buy some.
Well, I was going to say one day I'll go there. Well, that's the plan.
Vincent Dowd on Larry McMurtry, who's died at the age of 84. And that's it from us for now, but there'll be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. This edition was mixed by Jack Graysmark. The producer was Siobhan Leahy. The editor, as always, Karen Martin. I'm Valerie Sanderson. Until next time, bye-bye.
I'm Dessa, the host of Deeply Human, where we traipse into the uncharted darkness of our skulls to find out why we do the things we do.
Why do you fall for him or her?
Being a scientist, we're very, very cautious about what we say that we know for sure, because it's tough to prove stuff.
Honesty is a really good thing, and most people acknowledge it and they want to be honest, but we have lots of other motivation that play out.
Deeply Human, a BBC World Service and American Public Media co-production with iHeartMedia. Just search for Deeply Human. For Deeply Human. For Deeply Human. For Deeply Human.
you.